I'm so pleased to be joined now by Josh Tolentino from the Philadelphia Inquirer to talk about this weekend's matchup against the Giants. Hey, Josh, thanks for joining me.
Carolyn, been a busy week, but a pleasure to hop on here. The city here in Philadelphia, it's been buzzing the entire week all throughout downtown. The flags are going up, the banners, the big posters. It's playoff time here in Philadelphia, so very, very happy to join you.
Yeah, it's interesting. My vantage point is here in New York, where a lot of people feel like, I don't know if you want to run into the Giants right now. I mean, they seem to have a lot of momentum as well. This being the third time that the two teams have faced each other in a 7-week span, Philadelphia obviously has gotten the better of New York the previous two times. But do you see this particular contest, like you mentioned, now that it's playoff time, being a little bit more competitive this time around?
Certainly, especially compared to the most recent time that they met in that regular season finale. That just wasn't a fair way to gauge the strengths of both teams. I mean, the Giants were playing the reserves, and a big credit to them. They were competitive really throughout the entire game. They made it a game all throughout basically the end of the fourth quarter, playing with the reserves. Again, no Daniel Jones, no Saquon Barkley. The first game might be a better indicator, of what we might expect, or at least some tendencies. But I think it all comes down to how Don Martingale, the Giants defensive coordinator, how he counters Jalen Hurts. And, there's a lot of familiarity, especially with Brian Daboll and Jalen Hurts. Their story is very well documented. Their history together at Alabama, all that success that they had with each other. And even when Jalen was coming out in the draft, and Brian Daboll was one of his biggest supporters. So a lot of familiarity between these two staffs. Ultimately, again, it comes down to Jalen Hurts' health. And the biggest thing that we've noticed this week is that he's doing more. The last game that they played against the Giants in Week 18, Jalen was very, very limited. And, somewhat is that of his decision, but I think a majority of that came from the coaching staff and the way that he was deployed. This is an Eagles team that essentially runs off Jalen Hurts. If you've watched them over the past 2 years, they've transformed their playbook. And they've obviously gotten some good additions here with A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, those talented playmakers. But the playbook runs around Jalen Hurts' ability as a dual threat quarterback. He's been dealing with a shoulder injury over the past month. Week 16, he suffered it in Chicago. It's to his throwing shoulder. They described it as a sprain here in this joint that kind of connects the shoulder and the collarbone. Ultimately, it's going to be, again, how healthy is that shoulder? Is Nick Sirianni able to use him how he was previously? If he does, the Giants will, have to deal with a lot more compared to that regular season finale.
Yeah, that is the biggest question mark coming into the game. I mean, the one that everyone has sort of been pointing towards, will he or won't he? I know it's hard to predict and you can't speculate on how limited he may or may not be, but all indications in Philadelphia that we are going to see him on the field at least this weekend.
Yes, I've spent the past week, even during the bye week, the team had a couple practice sessions. Obviously, they practiced 3 times this week in preparation for Saturday's game. And by all indications, it seems like Jalen Hurts he definitely utilized the bye week to rehab and get healthy. But I don't think there will be any limitations to his game in regards to being able to call quarterback designed runs, being able to run some power options with Jalen. That's what makes him so dangerous. He has a franchise record that he beat his own record. Last year, he had 10 rushing touchdowns. This year, he's got 13. That beat Mike Vick's 9 rushing touchdowns, which stood for a very long time, was just one short of breaking the NFL record. I can say probably with full confidence that if he didn't get injured and missed those 2 games there near the end before he returned against the Giants, he would have broke Cam Newton's record. He was just one away. Franchise record as a passer, 35 touchdowns. So if Jalen Hurts is anywhere near close to his healthy self, the Eagles are just going to be in such a better place, especially in the red zone. I think that's where Wink Martindale and specifically Brian Daboll knew that Jalen wasn't going to run, so they were able to deploy their defenders, again, their reserves in Week 18. They'll have their starters, their full guys here in the playoffs, but If Jalen is able to tuck the football, if he's able to use his legs, especially in the red zone, the Giants will have a lot more to have to kind of counter throughout Saturday's game.
And the Giants defensive coordinator, Wink Martindale, is not afraid to get a little tricky, a little risky, a little creative. He loves the blitz. I mean, do you think that the Eagles are prepared to deal with whatever the Giants are going to bring them defensively? I know a lot of it rests on the health of Jalen Hurts, his ability to be mobile, do what he does. But, how does the Giants defense sort of stack up against Philly's offense?
Yeah, Jalen had said it himself. He opened this week with a very bold statement. There has been, messaging coming out from New York, coming out of Philly all week. But Jalen kind of set the tone, and his words specifically, and I quote, were, "I've got a bounty on me every week." And that message was reiterated throughout the locker room in the week. Lane Johnson, who's also dealing with his own injury over there on the right side, he's their franchise right tackle. He basically said those words. Him and Jordan Mailata, their other tackle, is that if Jalen's got a bounty, we've both have bounties on us. Luckily for the Eagles, even if Jalen's not 100%, even if Lane Johnson's not 100%, the Giants, one of their biggest strengths, when you analyze this team, Saquon Barkley, obviously, but on the defensive side, that interior line, they're wrecking crews down there. But luckily, again, for the Eagles, outside of the injuries to Lane Johnson and to Jalen Hurts, they have a very, very good offensive line here, Carolyn, in Philadelphia. The 5 starters were either named Pro Bowl starters or Pro Bowl alternates. So all 5 of them, 2 of them were all pros in Lane Johnson and Jason Kelce. Kelce, almost at this point of his career, seems like a bona fide future Hall of Famer. It was his 5th All-Pro selection just here in these past few weeks. So the strength is right there in the trenches, and I think it's going to be a battle. Again, as you kind of pointed out, Martindale, he loves the blitz. I think the Giants are close to 40%, definitely first in the league. It's going to be, again, how is Jalen Hurts going to counter that, and will he be able to use his legs?
You mentioned Saquon Barkley, who is coming off of something of a redemptive performance this past weekend that gave him a ton of momentum. I mean, he was certainly the story after the team's last win, everything that he's been through on the injury front, and now to kind of show up on the biggest of stages with this team that, quite frankly, just to make it to the playoffs feels like a win with Brian Daboll and the staff that he's brought into New York. Who do you think is going to be the X factor defensively for Philly in terms of trying to mitigate the damage that Saquon Barkley can potentially do?
When you assess the team's 3 losses, one of them was an anomaly. They didn't have Jalen Hurts in that game against the Cowboys. It was a shootout. Gardner Minshew played well. But they had 3 losses on the year, franchise low for them. And the 2 other losses, to Washington and to New Orleans, if I'm Brian Daboll, I am studying that tape to the T, because those 2 teams had the perfect game plan. They really ate up time of possession. They basically kept Jalen Hurts on the sideline. They try to run out the clock, as fast as they could all throughout the game. They've got a Pro Bowl running back there in Saquon Barkley, who might be capable of doing that. In regards to X factors on the defense, I mean, there are really a couple of them. Their 2 linebackers, Kaiser White and TJ Edwards, have been spotty at times throughout the year. Really, those 2 losses, if you think where the defense has been susceptible, I mean, this is the number 1 defense in the league in regards to yards allowed, just over 300. That's a league low. But an area where they've been susceptible at giving up big gains is on the ground, especially in those 2 games. Some in-season acquisitions that the team had when they were dealing with injuries to their first-round pick, Jordan Davis, who is a run clogger. Nick Ndamukong, a veteran that many people know, and Linval Joseph. I expect them to definitely see some run, but I think it starts there with the starters, Javon Hargrave, Fletcher Cox. They're going to have to clog the middle, and if Saquon decides to go outside, those Eagles defenders are going to have to be ready to set the edge, because that is certainly one area. If you had to identify one, Carolyn, that's one area that the Eagles definitely struggle with, is containing opposing running backs.
It's interesting. It could potentially be the difference in a game like this. As you kind of think about what the Eagles have done this season, I think even a couple weeks ago, many people would say it's a Super Bowl or bust in terms of what would be okay for Philly fans, just given how balanced they are in all aspects of the game and the way that Jalen Hurts has played before injury and what they've been able to accomplish. Is that still the feeling in Philadelphia that, the trajectory that they're on, obviously winning the conference, putting themselves in position with this bye week to prepare for the postseason, give him some rest? Is anything less than a Super Bowl enough?
Certainly, I think that's the point that's been stressed from Nick Sirianni. He's a very one day at a time type of guy, but they know the big picture that they've put together this franchise best season for they've never won 14 games in a season. They accomplished that this year. They didn't get the 1 seed for nothing. I mean, they got it to rest their bodies, to have home field advantage throughout the playoffs. I remember earlier in the offseason when this team got A.J. Brown, they traded for A.J. Brown on the night of the first day of the draft, and then they signed him to a $100 million contract. When Howie Roseman was introducing A.J. Brown at his introductory press conference, part of his messaging was a move like this is to not only help Jalen and A.J. have a very good chemistry and connection, even before they were teammates, dating back to pre-high school days even. But anyways, so, Howie's pointing that out. One other message that he used very specifically is that we want to host playoff games. We want to be able to be the type of team that we were in 2017 to compete for a Super Bowl. So I think the messaging was, set right there. And, they had so much success this season. I think anything that is not reaching Arizona, getting on that flight to compete against whoever the contender is from the AFC would be seen as a disappointment, because you look at across the NFC and the quarterbacks remaining. Daniel Jones, you have to give him credit. I mean, the game that he just had against the Vikings, probably one of the best of his career, as many have said throughout this week. But on the other side, they've got Dak, who they have a lot of experience with, and they've got a rookie in Brock Purdy. So just gauging, again, from the quarterbacks, you can look at the entire Eagles roster and see all the strengths that they have. But just from a quarterback perspective, they feel like defensively they have a strong advantage here with the 4 teams remaining in the NFC.
And Nick Sirianni and Hurts together, have been such a formidable kind of tandem, regardless of lack of experience in big moments and playoff moments. Is there any reason to think that this would be a sort of overwhelming atmosphere for them, or moment for either one of them heading into the playoffs with the weight of the world on their shoulders? You mentioned Jalen Hurts saying, I always have a bounty on me. I have a target on me. That's clearly some bulletin board material that he's using for motivation. What about Sirianni? Is he ready for this moment?
Oh, certainly. I think we've seen how this team has been built throughout the year. And one specific instance I want to recall is the Week 2 game that they had against the Minnesota Vikings. Minnesota was seen as a rising team, and we saw the success they obviously had as the year progressed. But it was a Monday night game. It was the first home game. And last year, not just the loss to the Bucs in the playoffs, but a lot of their primetime games, specifically the one in Dallas. That one stuck to Jalen's head. They got blown out. They were down by like 20 plus points in the second half. It was just, it was miserable watching if you're a fan. At that point, even covering the game, you just wanted it to be over with. It's just how overpowering the Cowboys were at that point. And Jalen, he mentioned after the Vikings game, and then they all actually played the Cowboys again a few weeks later in prime time before their bye week this season. He kind of alluded to, he didn't necessarily say the exact words, but he hinted at those bitter feelings sticking with him. I think he remembers the feeling, what it was like in Tampa, again, with a very different roster last year, losing to Tom Brady and the Buccaneers last year, that vaunted Bucs defense that was performing at a high level. I think he's going to be ready. And especially, again, we mentioned the familiarity with Brian Dable and their tendencies to blitz. If you actually look at the advanced numbers and analytics, Jalen's been much better against the blitz, not just compared to last year to this year, but even compared to himself as a pocket passer this season. He performs very, very well against the blitz. Again, his health is a big priority. We'll see exactly how stable that shoulder is, how comfortable they are rolling him out of the pocket in those running scenarios, being able to make plays with his legs. But I think Jalen and Nick Sirianni, to your question, I think they're built for this moment for sure.
If Jalen Hurts is a guy that doesn't forget, I wonder, you mentioned the history with Brian Dable, and it's been well documented dating back to Jalen Hurts' college days. They have said everything right, particularly Brian Dable, in terms of the amount of respect that he has for Hurts as a quarterback and as a person and what he's done. But still, if you dig a little deeper, he did bench him in college. And I wonder, on Jalen Hurts' side, I mean, do you think that there is still a world in which there is still a little bit of motivation, even though you would think that that would be history well in the rearview mirror, that maybe it's not particularly as friendly as it sounds on his side, and he'd love to get the better of his old coach?
I think that might bite him a little bit. I think his dynamic with Tua Tagovailoa is a bit more interesting. We saw them together earlier in the preseason. The Eagles spent a week down there in Miami. Miami actually had a bout with an illness that cut really their entire team. It affected their entire team, and they only had one practice session out of two scheduled ones. But during that first day, you kind of saw how Tua was interacting around Jalen, and it just didn't feel necessarily natural. Kind of felt forced in that regard. With Dable, it's much different. You definitely see the love there between those two. And not just that, I'll retell a story here really quick, but coming out of the draft, like what I mentioned earlier, Jalen Hurts was attending the combine. He was in and out of meetings. Nick Sirianni actually briefly met with him. And again, Nick was not with the Eagles at this time. Jalen Hurts was drafted by Doug Peterson, the former Eagles coach, now with the Jaguars. And there was an instance when Sirianni ran into Dable, and he basically pegged a quick question about Jalen Hurts because he had an upcoming meeting with Jalen Hurts. He asked him, what type of person he is, and Dable went on to say very good remarks. And we've seen how all the relationships between those three have evolved. I think, but Jalen itself, to get back to your question, I think he's just a very motivated individual in itself. I don't think he needs that added sense there, having to beat his former coach for sure.
So how do you expect Philadelphia to utilize Hurts then in more detail? I mean, if they are in a mindset of trying to protect that shoulder, is there a chance that they make him one-dimensional and we won't see him running as much? Do you think that we'll see him use his legs a little bit more in the red zone if there's a lucrative opportunity to really cash in? I mean, if he is sort of 80%, let's say, but there's still that risk that he might not be available, not only in this game, but moving forward, what does Philly do?
At this point, based on, what I've heard from the building and also just watching Jalen in practice, I would be very surprised if they had limitations or hesitancies to the game plan. I think we're going to see a much different team that we saw in Week 18. Week 18, he was barely running the ball. In the couple instances that we did see Jalen run the ball, we saw a Jalen that we're not used to seeing, Carolyn. I mean, he was sliding before contact, which is a smart thing to do. But the Jalen Hurts that we know, and a perfect descriptor of a past play that, again, perfectly describes who he is as a player. But that Monday night game against the Vikings earlier in the year, Week 2, Jalen, he takes a scramble and he goes up the right sideline. They're in the red zone. He gets stopped about the 7-8 yard line before he hits the 5. Initial defender makes contact. Another defender comes and Jalen spins out of that tackle. So he's at the 5 yard line. He's already encountered 2 defenders who should have brought him down. And then 2 more defenders try to pile on him. And he uses, all his entire body weight to stay upright. And it was an incredible touchdown. But what I'm trying to get at is that play is a perfect describer of who he is. He doesn't like sliding. He likes fighting for those extra yards. He likes adding those points for his team. I think that's the Jalen Hurts that we're going to see in these playoffs. And of course, anytime you're on the field, you're going to risk injury, and especially when you have an existing one in Jalen's case. But again, he's had he's been a beneficiary of being able to rest here on the bye week. And as the Giants like to deploy their blitz-heavy packages and schemes with Wink Martindale, I think Jalen Hurts is going to be ready. In addition to him running, Carolyn, I think some quick options to pay attention to: A.J. Brown and definitely Dallas Goedert. We saw the Giants defense last week give up 100-plus yards to T.J. Hawkinson. I think he had 10 catches on 11 targets. That's a crazy amount of number to any receiver, let alone a tight end. Dallas Goedert, I think, will definitely be looking to exploit some of those matchups.
Yeah, you just read my mind because I was about to ask you about the receiving core and A.J. Brown. I know you mentioned Smith as well. So you think that the advantage in that particular matchup against the Giants secondary goes to Philly's receivers?
I mean, Adoree Jackson is definitely a talented cornerback. It'll be interesting to see whether he lines up against Devontae Smith or A.J. Brown. He actually did not play in that first game. I think the Eagles are going to rely a lot on Miles Sanders in the run game. I mean, their strength, again, as we mentioned earlier, is the offensive line. And if you look at their first game against the Giants week 14, I think they ran for almost 260 yards. It was like in that 250 mid-range. That was their second most of the season. So, I mean, I think they're going to test the Giants front seven, see if they're ready for this rushing attack led by Miles Sanders. And a funny fact is that Miles, when he was named to the Pro Bowl, when he found out he's a first-time Pro Bowler, the first thing he did was FaceTime Saquon Barkley. They are two former teammates over here at Penn State. And, he just expressed so much joy, just congratulating him, and also, having excitement for himself. He was a first-time Pro Bowler. I spoke with Miles today. It's Thursday. Before we left the locker room, and had just kind of teased, knowing that he had FaceTime Saquon after that Pro Bowl selection. What's going on this week? Are you texting him? Are you guys FaceTime? It's all business here for Miles Sanders. So I think setting the tone is going to be definitely relying on the run game and the offensive line. Maybe some design quarterback draws there for Jalen Hurts, but certainly the top three targets in the passing game: A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, and Dallas Goedert.
Yeah, that's really kind of interesting context heading into such a huge weekend. It's like the phones somehow go silent whenever a matchup like this is headed that way between two guys like that. That's really cool. We've spent just a couple more for you here. We spent so much time talking about Jalen Hurts' health. Are there any other sort of key injuries or guys who are banged up that could come into play on Saturday?
Yeah, I think the two main ones to pay attention to, certainly Lane Johnson. He is their franchise right tackle, another potential Hall of Fame candidate whenever his career comes to a close. He says he wants to play for 2 more years, but he's been one of the best tackles in the league for quite some time now, and he has a torn tendon in his adductor. He's describing it as a groin injury. A couple years ago, just for reference, Cam Jordan played through it. Lane has been talking to Cam and other players who've had the same injury. But basically, as Lane put it, it's very, very painful. He's been testing it this week without pain meds because throughout the bye week, he was on a lot of pain medication. I would be surprised if he's not out there, because that's a testament to who Lane is as a player. Again, a very, very important piece there on the offensive line at right tackle. With Lane Johnson. And another thing to point out with his injury is that it does require surgery, and he's pushing it off until whenever the season ends. He's already described to us who he's going to get the surgery from, where he's going to get it. So, the operating table is ready, but he's ready to not say that he's done with football yet for this season. He wants to play in 3 more games, and he's going to test out that pain tolerance. The other one worth paying attention to, safety C.J. Gardner-Johnson. He finished tied for most interceptions in the NFL. He suffered a lacerated kidney back, I believe, towards the end of November and during the Packers game. Missed 5 games, came back in the regular season finale against the Giants. The crazy part, Carolyn, is that he missed those 5 games and he still finished with the most interceptions in the NFL. So that is a testament. Those first 3 months, he was making so many plays on the ball. And the probably the best part about his story is that he was a very, very late acquisition. They added him like a few days before week 1 in a trade with the New Orleans Saints, and they put him back there at safety. But his position, his strength, his calling is slot cornerback, and we'll definitely see him out there trying to make plays against Richie James, the likes of these Giants receivers. Because the Giants receivers are no slouch. Certainly, the Eagles have more star power, but I believe the trio of Giants receivers in the Vikings game combined for 10 plus catches, 150 yards. So the secondary has to be on top of their game. And C.J. Gardner-Johnson, he is back from that lacerated kidney injury, a big playmaker there for the Eagles.
Yeah, listen, I mean, the Giants right now are seem to be in the right frame of mind. You mentioned the play of Daniel Jones having his best performance of the year against Minnesota at the right time. And for whatever reason, Brian Daboll has these guys believing that their path may not be completely done, at least, against Philadelphia. Who ultimately wins the game, do you think, and why?
I think I've got to give it to the Eagles. And based on their franchise history, it's kind of a funny stat, especially since the added game here over the past couple of years that the NFL implemented. But the Eagles, in their franchise history, have never defeated a team 3 times in one season. Nick Sirianni brought that stat up, and he says, what does that have to do with this year's version of this team? And we've spoke throughout the segment about why this team is built for this moment. I think you just look at everything and as a whole and this entire season, it starts and goes as Jalen Hurts goes. So I think, again, his health is going to be the top thing to monitor throughout this game. Brian Daboll, Martindale, from the very beginning, they'll have to see how Jalen Hurts is being used and how they'll have to counter that. Basically, I think what they're going to try to force him to do is get him into bad decisions, make him into rush decisions, because he's been very good with the ball this year, just not just on the ground, but throwing the ball. I believe only 6 interceptions, definitely on the low end when compared to the rest of the starting quarterbacks here in the playoffs. But this train goes as Jalen Hurts goes. So definitely worth paying attention to early on. Because, again, it'll be up to the Giants to counter based on Jalen Hurts' health.
Yeah, hopefully we'll know pretty soon what he's able to give. And like you said, a lot of exposure to each other these two teams have had over the last couple of weeks. But this matchup in particular on Saturday is an entirely different animal with everybody back on the field and the implications really, really high. Josh Tolentino from the Philadelphia Inquirer, thanks so much for the analysis and insight. We appreciate it.
Carolyn, always a pleasure to hop on. I hope you enjoy this game and the rest of the playoffs here throughout the postseason.
You too. Thanks, Josh.